Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Cloud Unfiltered. I'm Ali Amagasu, and today I am joined by Alex Peay and Mike Place from SaltStack. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you coming on today. I know that I met your founder, or one of your founders, a long time ago at an OpenStack conference, and I was really interested in catching up and finding out what's going on with you. So thanks for taking the time. I'd love to start, as we usually do, by finding out how you got into tech. Alex, you want to start?
Sure. So I guess for me, I come from that generation that bridged the old world and the new world, if you will. So the tech started a little early with the old green screen word processors and moved into, I remember the screeching modems and just how amazing and awesome it was to be able to connect to a world outside of the small rural Utah town that I grew up in. I think I kind of started with that love for tech there, just being able to see how big of a reach it could have and these types of problems it could solve and the information it could bring to a place or a group or an organization that wasn't normally always integrated with the bigger, broader world. And just kind of grew a love from tech from there, moved into the bigger systems, bigger power, more compelling software, and just kind of became a love and passion that kind of drove me into this career path, and it was fun watching it grow and from just being, ones and zeros programming into a complete IT industry, and it's been a great experience for the last 15 years or so.
I assume you haven't been with SaltStack that entire time. Have you always been with startups, or where else have you worked?
No, I've bounced around a little bit. I started my career while I was in college with a company that grew up to become something called Inside Sales. I left there and went back to IBM, where I spent 10 years on the East Coast working for IBM and ultimately with their IBM cloud products that used OpenStack. And then I returned back to my hometown area in Utah and worked for a company called Domo that does business intelligence, and have been at SaltStack for about 2 years now.
Excellent. How about you, Mike?
Sure. I started programming on a Timex TI-80 way back in the early 80s, and spent a bunch of time. I worked for the University of Utah back when they were first deploying internet access across the university into Utah public schools, and helped build that out for many years. I spent quite a bit of time at Novell in their advanced development group. I also worked for quite a long time at an independent ISP in Salt Lake City that is focused primarily on security and old school things like Unix shell services and Usenet and UCP and things of that nature that I certainly wish there were more of in the world today. And I've been with Salt, I think, 4.5 years now. So since the very early days of Thomas and myself writing code on little tables in a very tiny office. And it's nice to see that we've grown since that point.
Now, a lot of our listeners will know what SaltStack is, but some won't. So can one or both of you give me a little description of what the company is and what it does and how it got started and why is it in Utah?
Sure, Mike, I'll defer to you on that one. You've been here longer.
Sure. Salt is a generalized automation platform for automating any type of computing device, from the very small to the very largest infrastructures in the world. It's written in Python. It is an open source project that was started in late 2011, early 2012. And it has grown substantially since then. At present, it is one of the largest Python-based open source communities in the world, and it continues to grow at an astounding rate. But it is the automation and management software that is typically used to provide configuration management services or command and control services to fleets of machines to ensure that they can do something all at once, or that they are all in compliance with a particular designation or what have you. But people use Salt to automate all aspects of their infrastructure, from connecting their applications to the OSs that run underneath them, to controlling their network devices, to reaching out and in between things like CI/CD systems and deployment pipelines, and the list goes on and on and on. But anything that can be automated, SaltStack is usually in the mix there somewhere.
Well, you bring up a good point. There's obviously other solutions that folks use. You guys compete with Puppet, Chef, Ansible. Not to create a commercial here, but why would somebody choose Salt or SaltStack instead of those other solutions? What's the advantage you guys bring to the table? Sure,
I could take that. So, I see this evolution effectively in 3 phases. We had, phase 1 with Mark Burgess and his brilliance in the creation of CF Engine in the early 90s. When Mark, really foresaw many of the problems that we face today, and invented this idea of stateful configuration management, right? The idea that we can describe the intended state of a system, and then we can build software which effectively enforces that state. Mark did this because he saw and presumably sees computing environments as being somewhat chaotic and being prone to failure, being prone to what he coined as configuration drift, right? The idea that if we configure a system in one way on a Monday, there's simply no guarantee that that system is going to be configured that same way on a Friday, whether that's from another human changing it, or from some sort of malicious behavior, or from some corruption on a disk, or from some failure, or from what have you. We always need to understand that a machine state moment to moment is never guaranteed by anything in the universe. And so, Mark did this, and CF Engine, of course, was and is a wonderful product that brought us, sort of through the automation space through the 90s. And then, of course, in 2008, we had that seminal talk at Velocity in New York City from John Allspaw, who was at the time at Flickr, called 30 Deploys a Day, in which he stood up on the stage and helped to sort of bring this idea of DevOps to the world, right? This idea that we can create cultures in which development teams and operations teams don't need to be oppositional to each other. Right, and as a part of this description, he described some of the automation tooling that can be used to make that happen. At the time, Puppet and Chef, right, were the big players in this space, right? Obviously, they still are, and in doing that, of course, the DevOps movement was born, and that I see sort of as phase 2, right? But one property of both the way that Chef approached this problem and the way that Puppet approached this problem is that they saw the description of the states of these machines as being best expressed as somewhat programmatic, right? Which is, a fancy way of saying that in some sense, right, they saw this as an imperative software programming problem, right? And that was great, and that was wonderful, right? And they enjoyed and enjoy to this day quite a bit of success. And then I think, it's fair to describe a third wave of automation software, and that's where you get Salt and Ansible, who saw the same type of problem, right? But both said, what, we don't need these fancy, DSLs, these fancy domain-specific languages, right, in order to describe the states of these systems. Instead, we can use a data-driven approach, right? And so both Salt and Ansible picked things up with YAML, right? And said, look, when we're going to describe a resource, we can do this in a declarative sense, right? And we can just use YAML, and we can say, okay, give me this resource, and then it's the job, of the configuration management engine and of the automation framework that sits underneath it to go out and figure out how to apply that change effectively to a system, right? So you sort of asked about some of the differences and some of the reasons that I think Salt has an advantage. In that description, I sort of compared the second wave to this third wave, right? One of the insights that I think Salt had here is that we saw what at the time was this battle between a declarative approach and an imperative approach to configuration management as being a false dichotomy. Right? And we said, look, we think we can do both of those things. And so we set out to try to build a configuration management approach that could come at it from whatever direction the engineer in question wanted to come at it. And I think that was a really powerful insight. The second thing that I think Salt brings to the table that is really compelling is that right now, nobody questions this notion that infrastructures are becoming tremendously more complex, and complex in a non-linear rate, right? In the age of containerization, right, we're going from, okay, fine, it used to be fine. I had a data center, and in that data center, I can put 10,000 machines. And then we had virtual machines. And then it was, okay, I can have a data center, and I can have 10,000 physical machines, and I can have 100,000 virtual machines, and that's to manage, right? But now we're in this, this age of containerization, and in data centers, we can have millions, we can have tens of millions of containers that need to be managed. And as we change from this this old approach of application development to this new idea of building containerized distributed systems, one of the problems that comes up there is a problem of knowability, right? How at any point do you know, right, what the state of this system is? Because you can't come to me and say, oh, well, I'm going to monitor 10 million containers in a data center. How do you think that's going to work?
Right.
Like, at no point can we ever know the true state of these systems. And that should be something that we should all be worried a lot about. That's exceedingly problematic. And so to answer your question directly, some of these other products, I think, are primarily concerned about what I call the birth of the resource, right? They're concerned about the original configuration management problem. How do I take stock image X and turn it into application server Y? Right? I might need to install package A, B, and C, D. Same idea, with Docker, right? And that's what Docker run does, and so Docker files, so on and so forth, right? But again, because of this problem of unknowability in these complex distributed systems, the argument that Salt makes at the end of the day is that you need an automation framework that speaks to the entire life cycle of the infrastructure, the entire life cycle of these resources as they're deployed, right? Because we need to be able to manage them much past their birth, right? But beyond that, we also need, in these complex, potentially unknowable systems, we need to build out automation approaches that can respond to events, that can respond to the state of the infrastructure itself with some degree of autonomy. Right, so that pieces of these infrastructures don't have to necessarily be top-down command and control in a hierarchical sense, right? But that we can introduce automation that tries to listen to the state of the application, that tries to listen to what the OS is telling it, right? Or information about the CI/CD system, what deployment might be happening at that time. Ingest all of that and then make intelligent decisions about how the infrastructure itself needs to respond in order to keep itself healthy.
Nice answer.
Thank you.
I got that. Is there anything you want to add to that, Alex?
Yeah, I just kind of chime in on that last part. One of the things that we see as a critical piece as we move forward is what we call that event-driven automation or event-driven infrastructure. As Mike so eloquently explained, these infrastructures are just getting more and more complex. There's more and more to manage. There's more and more to listen to. I mean, it really mimics the world we live in, where there's more data there to be consumed, which should make it so that we can make better decisions based on that data. And that framework that Mike was talking about really stands on being able to consume those events, understands what's happening, and then take the appropriate automation based off of data rather than having it be a command and control issue that comes, like you said, from the top down. And so that event-driven automation, that event-driven viewpoint is one that we think is very powerful and is key to the success of SaltStack moving forward. And really anybody that's going to try to manage one of these growing complex infrastructures that has become commonplace over the last few years.
That makes sense. So, you know, some of the things you mentioned, Mike, kind of got me thinking about the larger automation story. You know, you talked to SaltStack and some of your current competitors, but if I'm a customer out there right now, or someone running, you know, an IT operation, what should I be automating? What are most customers already automating? What aren't they automating? What opportunity are they missing as far as automation?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of things to say about this. One, even though it sounds wonderful in a marketing sense to say that we should automate all of the things, I don't think that's true. And I think we need to be realistic about where automation makes sense and where it does not, right? Because there is just no universal truth to any of this. And so it's extremely important to be judicious. And one way that we can, you know, think about how do we start down this automation journey is that the first and frankly hardest rule should be that we should not automate things that we don't really understand, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental problems in this space, right? Is that whether you look at automation from a configuration management perspective or from a workflow perspective, it's all abstraction in the same way that programming languages are abstraction layers for physical computing devices, right? We're abstracting away the complexity of the application. We're abstracting away the complexity of what rides underneath, right? And so we need to think about whether or not that abstraction serves us, right? In some cases it does, right? There's a reason that, you know, sometimes we write things in C and sometimes we write things in Rust, right? And one of the ways that we make that difference, or we choose between those things, is we think about the degree of abstraction that we want to have. And I think that we need to think about automation in that same sense, because automation is fundamentally an abstraction layer for any type of system that it's applied to.
Right. And you touched on something right at the beginning of that answer that I had another guest mention. He said, you know, you need to build something by hand before you automate it. You need to know how it works. You don't just get to go automating things that you don't already understand. And I wish I could remember which guest it was so I could give him credit for it. But I think to some degree you were saying the same thing at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this story that I tell when I go out into the world and talk about this. You know, some people have read about this disaster in Galveston, Texas, that happened some number of years ago. And not to tell the whole story, but it was an enormous explosion that happened because ammonium nitrate was loaded onto this large vessel. Well, what happened was, you know, it began to aerosolize, right? And it turns out that they had just built this new system, right, in which they could steam the hold, right, if a problem was detected. Well, guess what happens when you add steam to that chemical compound, right?
Something exciting, I bet.
Right. I think it's got really exciting in a hurry. They built automation into a system that they didn't actually understand, right? You know, it's really easy to create catastrophic failure, right? And if you don't understand the system that you're applying automation to. And we see that a lot when we go out and we talk to people that they more or less understand the pieces of the system that have been problematic, or they more or less understand the pieces of the system that they've built themselves, right? Or they more or less, you know, kind of understand things because some other, you know, engineer was nice enough to write some documentation. Well, then they come along and they try to apply automation to that, right? And things don't always go great, right? And so I do think that it's important to use the automation journey, especially like when you're bringing this into something that's going to like be a brownfield, that's going to sit on top of an existing application, an existing infrastructure, that people also use it as an opportunity for documentation and for knowledge transfer and for understanding which pieces they really get and which pieces they really don't. Because again, otherwise problems might happen.
So when you look at the market, where do you feel like there's the biggest opportunity for customers to automate that they aren't already? You know, I kind of would assume at this point, you know, there's a lot of things that it's pretty standard. We're automating this part of our infrastructure. We're automating that. Like containers. Is that still like a wide open opportunity, or what's the opportunity for automation?
There is a lot to say about containers, but my honest answer to that is networking, is network gear. There's so much work being done in that field by automation vendors, including SaltStack and other automation folks in our space. There is a lot of opportunity to do a lot of amazing things. Cloudflare, for example, is a company that has invested really aggressively in network automation, and they've invested really aggressively in this event-driven story, right? Now, let me tell you about why that's important to them, right? Because they needed to go, okay, look, our fundamental business is responding to denial of service attacks. Right? Well, how do we respond to denial of service attacks, right? We detect that they're coming in, right? We sort of try to figure out what they are. But the other piece of that is, well, look, now network gear has to be either reprovisioned or reconfigured or adapted in some way because the infrastructure has to adapt to the attack, right?
Right.
And look, automation, right, and configuration management and an event-driven approach are the proper set of solutions for solving this problem, right? So there's a ton of opportunity in the network space for people to introduce automation.
Yeah.
Hey. Go ahead.
Just to add into that, you know, taking that the next step, we see a lot of customers that are coming to us right now talking about IoT use cases. And I think this blends into the network discussion too. And, you know, they're trying to figure out how do, you know, I've got this product that works as a control for thermostats in hotel rooms. How do I manage all those things? What do I want to see from those things? And it comes back to, you know, just those are a device that we can get insight into, that we can start to let them have some control over. And especially in that IoT world, I think that that's important because as they look at success, these customers, they're looking at exponential growth, right? They're not successful with their POC of a few thousand nodes. They need to see that growth happen in such a way that they have many devices that they're out there managing. And to Mike's point, what we see them do is start with that POC, get an understanding and where they get success. And then, of course, they're able to grow that opportunity with the help of Salt and other management tools.
So the mention about the IoT situation and even you talking about the networking automation, Mike, gets me thinking, what's coming in automation? I'd love to hear, first off, I guess, what's in the latest release of your product, Oxygen, I believe it's called. What new functionality is there? And then kind of what's on the horizon? What's exciting in the automation world?
Right. We've worked really hard on our OpenStack support and our containerization support, as well as our network support in the latest release of Oxygen. And that's pretty typical for where automation vendors are moving right now, because there's so much opportunity in all of those spaces. I think the other part of your question was about where automation is going in the future. And wow, there's a lot to say about this. You know, I think some people improperly frame this debate, right? They improperly frame it as saying, well, is the idea of containerization and immutable infrastructure oppositional to configuration management, right? Is it is it oppositional to automation as seen in the traditional sense? You know, what threat, if any, does Kubernetes pose to all of this? I'm not particularly convinced by those arguments. And the reason that I'm not is that every time we've seen an evolution in infrastructure, right, and automation has had to respond to that change, all it's done is it's changed the level of abstraction, right? The need for automation doesn't go away. So if we change that debate so that we think about distributed systems, right, as being a really big computer where every container is a single process, right? Then, why does, configuration management may start to look more like orchestration, and that's all fine and good, but that's still a form of automation, right? So there's going to be some sort of evolution in this space as the way that we design systems starts to change. But I hardly believe that we're going to see anything but an increased need for automation over time.
Right. It seems to me like containers, by the very way they're set up, involve a lot of processes that are kind of tedious and repetitive and beg to be automated. And I realize Kubernetes does a lot of that, but I also feel like Kubernetes has left a lot of opportunities open, a lot of kind of loose ends that aren't tied up that automation products could deal with.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is not everyone has a Kubernetes-shaped problem, right?
There you go.
And Kubernetes absolutely solves a set of problems very elegantly. There is no question about it, right? But Kubernetes is still it's still containerization with a scheduler and a lot of other pieces built on top, right? It's a form of a distributed OS. That in no way, I think, mitigates both automation, right, to control Kubernetes itself, right? Because look, the stuff is still running on real iron, right? We still have to manage all of that. We're still going to have to manage, by the way, the deployment of the application onto Kubernetes. And I see Kubernetes as fundamentally being a distributed operating system, right? And so, look, if we still have to automate above it and below it, that's the same way that we've still had to automate above and below existing operating systems, right? It's just a change in the level of abstraction, is all.
That makes sense. Alex, how about you? What are you seeing on the horizon that's exciting as far as automation?
Well, one of the things to point out with what Mike's been talking about, we do have with Salt, we go back to that first answer that he gave, there's a lot of things that we can do with Salt, right? Like you can manage any number of devices, you can manage any number of OSs. The complexity continues to grow. And one of the things that we've done at SaltStack specifically is build an enterprise product that can deliver some common solutions and use cases through what we call our enterprise product. And one of the areas that we see a lot of traction, a lot of interest is around security. A number of us just left the RSA conference and had some really interesting discussions down there about what people see as automation in the security space. If we talk to a lot of vendors, and we talk to a lot of customers, we hear that a remediation in a lot of people's lingo is equivalent to a report that helps them understand what's wrong with their environment. But it doesn't go that next step and give them what we call kind of an integrated action arm, right? And SaltStack is one of those tools that can provide that integrated action arm. We can understand what's going on in your environment. We can get a report that comes from some scanning tool and take those events in and understand, hey, this is where your problems are. And instead of just pointing and saying, hey, it looks like your house is on fire, we can pick up buckets and go put that out, right? We can help our customers take that step. And too often we see people saying, oh, remediation and automation can stop with insight. And that's not what we believe, right? We view this as being a very action-oriented space, and one that needs to continue to be so. And that really dovetails well with the security world as it is today, right? As you go through RSA and you talk to people and you sit in those meetings, there's a lot of concern about what's going on and being proactive about getting in front of these threats. And providing insight is good, but not sufficient. And I think that's an area that's going to be really important for SaltStack as we move throughout the rest of this year, is being able to help our customers be more action-oriented, especially in areas where they see vulnerability and risk, where we can come in and help them kind of be that partner, like I said, pick up the bucket and go work on the problem with them instead of just kind of pointing from the sidelines saying, you should fix that. And I think that's going to be an area of importance for us as we move forward.
That's great. So you bringing up RSA got me kind of thinking about conferences a little bit. I know you guys were a recent sponsor of Scale, and I feel like you used to be, and you probably still are, very active in the open source community. Is that true?
Absolutely.
As a company?
Yeah.
I mean, Salt is open source, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Salt is open source Apache 2 licensed. It's a very active community. It's on GitHub, github.com/SaltStack. Yeah, absolutely. The Salt itself is open source from end to end.
Awesome. So I know you have a conference every year called SaltConf. Can you tell me a little bit about that, about when it's happening, where it is, what kind of people should go to it, and which one shouldn't?
Alex?
Sure. So we have an annual conference. This year it's going to be, let me check the dates here, it's going to be September 10th through the 13th. And it's a great opportunity to come and learn more about, one, the community, how to contribute, how to participate, how to have those discussions with Mike, the developers, with other customers that have been working with Salt, and kind of get lessons learned of what's going on there. It's also a great opportunity to come in and get an understanding of where we're going from a product direction standpoint, right? This is an opportunity not just for, you know, us to get up on a stage and talk about roadmaps from a product standpoint, but also to sit down and talk about your use cases and get an understanding of why you want something like Salt, how you're using it, where you've felt some friction and where you've had great success, so that we can, you know, take that information and of course make it more valuable as we move forward. We hold this event every year here in Salt Lake City at the Salt Palace. You know, we brand out the whole city and venue, so that's where it's held. And like I said, it's this year from the 10th of September to the 13th.
Do you do any hands-on tutorial kind of classes, things like you might see, like for instance, a Cisco conference? You know, we do a lot of hands-on training now. We didn't used to, but now we do, and that's one of our most popular things. You know, we have lines of people trying to get into our DevNet sessions, which is where we're teaching network engineers, you know, how to develop on top of our hardware.
Yeah. So the way the conference is set up, actually, the first 2 days, we have kind of a pre-conference training session. So we got 2 days of training where you can come in and work with both our PS teams as well as engineers on kind of the cutting edge technology, as well as your typical training courses. And then those last 3 days are the typical conference experience. And so, yeah, we use that whole week to provide both the upfront training and then the conference content.
Nice. That sounds great. Will both of you gentlemen be in attendance?
Yes, we will.
Speaking,
Yes,
teaching, all that? All
the above.
All the above. Excellent. Is there anything I haven't covered that we wanted to talk about today?
Not from me. There's always more to say about the automation space, but we certainly were able to cover a lot of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you shared. I know I learned some stuff today. I hope our audience did as well. And I hope you guys will be on again in the future to kind of keep us updated as to what's going on with your company, because I think it's an interesting space you occupy. Are you still doing a lot with OpenStack at all?
Yeah, we're still doing, we have very broad OpenStack support, like I mentioned earlier. We've been working really hard on making sure that's all up to date and is a first-class citizen inside the Salt ecosystem. So we're really, really proud of our OpenStack support.
Excellent, excellent. So I don't know when the next OpenStack Summit's coming up, but I know that's just fluttering through my mind now that you're speaking about that. Anyway, aside from SaltConf, are there other places that folks should look for you if they want to connect and learn a little bit more? Are there any places you'll be speaking or anything like that?
I will be I'm all over the place. And
give me a few.
It's not too hard to find me. I will certainly be at SaltConf. I will be at the Open Source Data Center Conference in Berlin coming up. And for those in the Western US, I'll be delivering the keynote address at Open West this year in Salt Lake City. There we go. And what's your Twitter handle, or do you have one? I do have one. It's Cashed Out, CACHEDOUT. Very clever. And Alex, how about you?
Yeah, mine's not nearly as clever. It's Alex Peay, ALEXPEAY.
Oh, that's the good thing about having an unusual name, right?
That's right.
I knew when I signed up for Twitter, there were no other Ali Amagasus I was going to have to compete with for the handle. I was pretty much going to be the only one. So. Yep. Well, thanks again, gentlemen. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you. Hand me any URLs that you'd like me to include in the show notes for guests who want to learn more about your company, about your products, about where you'll be speaking, and I will attach those. So have a terrific afternoon. And again, I appreciate your time.
Thank you
so much.
Bye-bye.